The cell door slammed shut with a sound that didn't belong to a building. It belonged to a verdict. Somewhere down the tier, a fluorescent tube buzzed and gave up, flickered, came back weaker. A paperback hit the concrete floor and skidded under a bunk. Pages folded open to a chapter the man on the top bunk had read 4 times that week. He didn't reach for it. He sat with his elbows on his knees and listened to the building breathe around him, the slow exhale of 900 men who had nowhere to go. A guard's keys jangled past, then stopped. Then walked back. Then stopped again, longer this time, like the guard was reading a name on the door and trying to decide what to do about it. Why would 3 companies be standing in the parking lot at 6 in the morning waiting for a convicted felon to walk out the gate? Stay with me on this one. His name was Marcus Aldrich. He was 31 years old, 6'1", with the long, patient hands of a man who had once intended to become a high school math teacher, and had instead taken a wrong turn at 23 that he could trace back, in retrospect, to a single Tuesday afternoon. He had grown up in a row house on the east side of Cleveland, the second of 4 children, the son of a hospital janitor, and a woman who took in ironing on the side and read library books out loud at the kitchen table after dinner. He had been the kid who corrected his teachers gently, the kid who tutored other kids during recess for a grape soda or nothing at all, the kid the principal walked past every morning with a small, hopeful nod. He had finished high school 3rd in his class and gone to a state college on a scholarship that paid most of his tuition and none of his rent. He worked nights at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, loading pallets onto trucks, and slept 4 hours a night for 2 years. In his junior year, his father had a stroke that ate through what was left of the family savings inside of 6 weeks. Marcus dropped out a semester short of his degree to come home and help. He took a job at an auto parts store, then a second job driving for a small delivery service, then a third bartending on weekends, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, he met a man named Dennis who told him there was an easier way. Dennis was charming. Dennis wore a watch that cost more than Marcus made in a month. Dennis said it was just a couple of pickups, just driving, no questions asked, no real risk if you used your head. Marcus used his head. He said no for almost a year. Then his mother's diabetes got bad and her insurance lapsed, and the pharmacy stopped filling the prescription that kept her from going blind, and Marcus said yes one Tuesday afternoon at 4:18 in the parking lot of a diner on Lorraine Avenue. He drove a sealed package from a warehouse in Cleveland to an address in Akron. He was paid $800 in cash. He drove home shaking. He did it again 2 weeks later. Then a third time. On the 4th run, in March, the car behind him on the interstate was an unmarked DEA vehicle, and the men he was working for had been under surveillance for 9 months. The package in his trunk contained 6 kilograms of a substance that, under federal sentencing guidelines, carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years. His public defender was a tired man with a stack of files on his passenger seat who told Marcus, kindly, that the best thing he could do was take the plea. Marcus took the plea. He stood in front of a judge in a charcoal suit his uncle had loaned him and listened to a sentence read out loud that contained the number 12 and the word years. And he did not cry until the bailiff put a hand on his elbow and walked him out a side door he had not noticed when he came in. He arrived at the federal facility in Pennsylvania on a Thursday in June. He was issued 2 khaki uniforms, a pair of canvas slip-ons, a thin mattress, a plastic cup, a plastic spoon, a comb, and a paper card with a number on it that would replace his name on every official document for the next decade. He was assigned to a 2-man cell on the 3rd tier of B Unit. His cellmate was a 48-year-old man from Pittsburgh named Ray who had been inside for 9 years and who looked Marcus up and down on that first afternoon and said only, "You read." It wasn't a question. Marcus had brought 1 paperback in his property box, a battered copy of a novel his mother had pressed into his hands at the visitation room of the county jail. The first months inside, Marcus did what almost every new inmate does. He kept his head down. He learned the count times, the chow times, the unwritten rules about which phone you could use and which table in the day room belonged to which group. He lost 14 pounds in the first 6 weeks and gained back 9 in the second 6. He learned not to look at certain men and not to look away from others. He learned the particular quality of silence that fell over a tear at 3 in the morning, broken only by someone weeping into a pillow 2 cells down, and the slow, mechanical clack of the climate system pushing recycled air through a vent that had not been cleaned in 20 years. He wrote his mother every Sunday. He read whatever the prison library would lend him, which wasn't much, and he reread the paperback his mother had given him until the spine cracked clean down the middle. He thought often about the path he had not taken and the classroom he was supposed to be standing in front of, and he thought about it the way a man thinks about a country he has never visited but believes he was meant to live in. He did not, in those first months, speak more than 10 sentences in a single day to any human being. It started with Ray. Ray could not read. Marcus had been in the cell for almost 5 months before he understood this, and he understood it the way you understand a language you weren't taught, by accumulation. Ray would hold a letter from his sister upside down for a full minute before turning it. Ray would ask Marcus casually what the commissary form said this week, what the new posting on the unit bulletin board meant, what the words on the back of a soup packet were trying to tell him about the cooking time. Ray was a man who had built a life inside the walls on a careful architecture of bluffs and shortcuts, and Marcus, once he saw it, could not unsee it. He did not say anything at first. He simply began to read things out loud in a way that did not embarrass anyone. He read the bulletin board to the cell at large. He read the back of the soup packet to himself in a voice slightly louder than necessary. He read his sister's letters with Ray sitting on the lower bunk, pretending to clean his glasses. After a few weeks of this, on a cold November evening with the heat clanking through the pipes, Ray sat down across the small metal table bolted to their wall and said, quietly, "Can you teach me?" Marcus said yes before Ray finished the sentence. They started with the alphabet. Ray, at 48, with a body that had survived 3 knife wounds and a heart attack, sat across the table from a man 17 years his junior and traced the shape of a lowercase b in a notebook with a stubby golf pencil and asked, with no embarrassment at all, "Am I doing it right?" Marcus said yes. Marcus said almost. Marcus said try it again this way. They worked for an hour every night after the 8 o'clock count, and on weekends for 2 hours in the morning before the day got loud. Ray learned the alphabet in 3 weeks. He learned to write his own name by the end of the first month. The first time Ray signed a commissary slip with his own hand instead of a thumbprint, he looked at the paper for a long time and then he looked at Marcus and he said, "I'm 60 years inside this body, and this is the first time it ever told the truth on paper." By February, Ray could read a children's book that Marcus had borrowed from the prison chapel. By April, he could write a letter to his sister in his own hand, 6 awkward sentences about the weather and the food, and his sister wrote back asking who had taught him because the handwriting was new, but the voice was finally his. Ray cried reading that letter in the lower bunk with one arm thrown over his face. Marcus pretended not to notice, the way men do for each other in a place where pretending is sometimes the only kindness available. Word travels in a prison the way fire travels through dry grass. By summer, 3 other men on the tier had come to Marcus, separately in the laundry in the chow line on the yard, and asked him in the careful, sideways way men inside ask things, whether he might have a few minutes to look at something with them. One could read but couldn't do basic math. One had a 6th grade education and wanted to write a letter to his daughter that didn't make her ashamed. One was preparing for a parole hearing and could not get through the language on his own paperwork. Marcus said yes to all three. He started using the day room table at the back of the unit, the one nobody wanted because it was under the broken light. He worked with one man at a time, an hour each, 4 nights a week. He made his own worksheets on legal pads with a big pen, copying problems out of a math book he had borrowed from the chaplain. He cut up old cardboard from soup boxes to make flashcards. He kept a list in the back of his notebook, in his small, careful handwriting, of every man who had asked for help and what each one was working on. The list at the end of his first year had 11 names. The teacher in him, which had been buried for 9 years under warehouse shifts and bad decisions and the fluorescent silence of a federal cell, started to walk around inside his chest again like a man stretching after a long sleep. He began to look forward to evenings. He began to think about the next lesson while he was peeling potatoes in the kitchen detail. He began to feel, for the first time since the bailiff had touched his elbow in that courtroom, like the days were arriving instead of just passing. On a Tuesday evening in October of his second year, the warden's assistant walked through B Unit on a routine inspection and noticed 5 men sitting around the day room table under the broken light, none of them watching the television, all of them bent over a single sheet of paper while a 6th man pointed at something with a pencil. She stopped. She watched for almost a full minute. Then she walked back to the warden's office and she said, "You should come look at this." The warden, a 62-year-old man named David Carrington, who had been in corrections for 37 years, walked down to B Unit himself the next afternoon and watched Marcus explain long division to a 40-year-old man who had failed it 3 times in 3 different schools as a child. Carrington did not interrupt. He stood at the back of the day room with his hands behind his back for 20 minutes. Then he left. That night Marcus sat on his bunk with the worksheet spread around him and felt good, for the first time in a long time, in a way that did not require apology. He fell asleep with his hand still resting on a notebook. Outside, snow was beginning to fall over the yard, and the lights along the perimeter fence threw long, soft shadows onto the white. The unit was quiet. Ray was already asleep. The whole building seemed, for one strange hour, to be holding its breath in the warm dark, the way a house holds its breath the night before a child is born. The warden came back on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later, and he did not stand at the back of the day room. He walked straight up to Marcus, who was in the middle of explaining fractions to 2 new men, and he said, "Aldrich, my office, 15 minutes." The whole table went still. In a federal prison, you do not get called to the warden's office for good news. Marcus closed his notebook. He walked back to his cell and put on a clean shirt and went down the long corridor with his hands at his sides and his mouth dry. He sat in a wooden chair in front of a desk and looked at the photographs on the wall and waited for the warden to tell him the unauthorized tutoring would have to stop. The warden did not say that. The warden leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on his stomach and said, "How would you feel about doing this officially?" He told Marcus the facility had been cited 2 years in a row for low GED completion rates among the inmate population. He told Marcus the contract education provider had pulled out the previous spring because the state had cut funding. He told Marcus there was a small classroom on the 2nd floor of the education building that had been sitting empty for 11 months, and there was a budget line, just barely, for textbooks and pencils, and a single instructor's stipend of 40 cents an hour. He told Marcus he was not allowed, under federal regulations, to hire an inmate as a teacher of record, but he was allowed to designate one as a peer tutor under the supervision of the education coordinator, who happened to be the warden's assistant, the same woman who had stopped at the day room table. Marcus went back to his cell that afternoon and sat on the bunk and looked at his hands for a long time. Ray came in from the yard and looked at his face and said, "What?" Marcus told him. Ray was quiet for almost a minute and then he said, you're going to need a bigger notebook. Before we go further, if a story about a man teaching 47 other men how to read inside a federal prison is the kind of story you want more of, take 1 second to subscribe. It's free, it tells the algorithm to bring you more stories like this one, and it's how channels like this one stay alive. Now back to Marcus. The classroom on the second floor of the education building had 2 long tables, 12 metal folding chairs, a chalkboard, no chalk, 3 boxes of donated textbooks from a local community college, and a window that looked out over the recreation yard. Marcus walked into it on a Monday morning in November with 6 students. By the following Monday, he had 9. By Christmas, he had 14, and the warden had to bring in a second-hand bookcase from a storage room to hold the workbooks Marcus had begun to organize by subject. The men came from every unit in the prison. They came in the mornings, in the afternoons, in the evenings after their work assignments. They came on weekends. Marcus worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 40 cents an hour, and on Sundays he wrote lesson plans on legal pads in the dim light of his cell while Ray slept in the bunk below. He divided the men into 3 groups by skill level and rotated between them. He held one-on-one sessions during the lunch hour for the men who were too embarrassed to admit, in front of the others, what they did not yet know. He learned to teach a man how to read by starting with the letters in his own children's names. He learned to teach long division by counting cigarettes, the only currency every inmate understood. He learned to teach essay writing by asking each man to describe, in 1 paragraph, the first meal he intended to eat on the day he got out, and then teaching him to revise it 3 times until the sentences sat on the paper in the right order. The first man in his program took the GED in March of the following year. His name was Eduardo. He was 37. He had dropped out of school in the 8th grade in Texas, and he passed every section on the first try. He came back from the testing room with the certified letter in his hand, and he walked up to Marcus in the hallway outside the classroom, and he held the letter out and he could not speak. Marcus took the letter, and he read it and he handed it back. The 2 of them stood there in the hallway for a long time. Then Eduardo went back to his unit and showed the letter to every man he passed. By the end of that calendar year, 11 men had passed the GED in Marcus's program. By the end of the year after that, the number was 23. The warden requested and received an expanded budget. Marcus was given a second-hand desk for the classroom and a key to the supply closet. He trained 2 of his earliest students, men who had passed their own GEDs, to serve as assistant tutors. He developed his own curriculum on legal pads, a 4-month program that he refined every quarter based on what worked and what did not. He kept records, in his careful handwriting, of every man who came through the classroom door. He kept the list of names in a green spiral notebook that lived in the locked drawer of the classroom desk, and at the end of every successful test, he wrote the date next to the name in blue ink. By his 8th year inside, the green notebook contained 47 names in blue ink. 47 men who had walked into his classroom unable to write their own address and walked out with a high school equivalency credential and a transcript that, for the first time in their lives, contained the word passed. Some of them had already been released by then. A few had written him letters from the outside, careful, awkward letters, with the handwriting of men still learning to trust the page, telling him about jobs and apartments and daughters. They were now able to read bedtime stories too. He kept those letters in the same locked drawer. In the 9th year of his sentence, Marcus came up for early release based on good time credits, his clean disciplinary record, and a recommendation letter from Warden Carrington that ran to 4 single-spaced pages. The release date was set for a Friday morning in late spring, 6 in the morning, processing complete by 5:45, walk out at 6 sharp through the front gate. His mother, whose diabetes had stabilized, intended to drive up from Cleveland the night before with his younger sister and a thermos of coffee, and a clean shirt that he had not yet seen. They planned to be in the parking lot at 5:30 in the morning, to be the first faces he saw on the other side of the fence. They were not the first faces. They were the fourth, fifth, and sixth. Friday morning came in cold and bright. Marcus had not slept. He had given away every paperback in his property box the night before, traded his slip-ons to a man in the next cell for a pack of stamps, and signed the last entry in the green spiral notebook over to one of his assistant tutors with a long letter of instructions on the next quarter's curriculum. At 4 in the morning, a guard he had known for 7 years walked him down the long corridor to processing. At 5:45, he was wearing a pair of jeans and a button-down shirt that had been folded in a property box for 9 years, and he was holding a manila envelope containing a state ID, a debit card with $300 on it, and a folded copy of his discharge paperwork. At 5:58, a different guard unlocked the front gate. At 6 exactly, Marcus stepped through it. The parking lot was full of mist. He saw his mother first, standing by the open passenger door of his sister's car, both hands pressed to her mouth, and he started walking toward her. Then he saw the 3 other vehicles. They were parked in a row along the fence. 2 pickup trucks and a sedan. 3 men were standing beside them in jackets against the cold morning, holding paper cups of coffee, watching him walk. The first man stepped forward as Marcus reached the edge of the lot. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered with a graying beard and the worn leather jacket of a contractor. His name was Henry Castellan. He owned a construction company in Pittsburgh that employed 46 men. His brother had been in the program. His brother had passed the GED 2 years earlier and was now a foreman on one of Henry's crews. Henry held out a folder. Inside the folder was an offer letter for a position as the company's training coordinator, designing literacy and credentialing programs for new hires, salary $48,000 a year, health insurance, a 4-day workweek. The second man stepped forward next. He was younger, in a Navy windbreaker, the regional director of a nonprofit out of Philadelphia that placed formerly incarcerated people into job training pipelines. His name was Daniel Rhee. He had heard about Marcus from 3 different former students who had come through his program. He had a folder too. His folder contained an offer for a curriculum design role, salary $42,000, with the explicit job description of building, from scratch, a model adult literacy program that the nonprofit intended to license to 12 other states. The third man stepped forward last. He was older than the other 2, in a long wool coat, with the careful posture of a man who was used to being listened to. His name was Dr. Albert Mendez. He was the dean of continuing education at a small private college outside Cleveland. His college had recently received a grant to design a degree completion program for adults with criminal records. He did not have a folder. He had a single sheet of paper. The sheet of paper was a letter offering Marcus a full scholarship to complete the bachelor's degree he had abandoned 10 years earlier, plus a paid graduate assistantship to work on the new program design, plus a guaranteed teaching position the moment he finished his master's. Marcus stood in the parking lot in the mist with 3 folders in his hands, and his mother 20 feet away with both hands still pressed to her mouth, and he did not say anything for almost a full minute. The 4 men, the 3 employers and the man who had walked out of the gate, stood in a small loose circle on the wet asphalt. A bird called somewhere in the trees beyond the fence. Then Marcus turned and walked the last 20 feet to his mother, and he put his arms around her and he held on. He took the job at the nonprofit. He turned down the construction company with a handwritten letter that thanked Henry Castellan for the second chance he had once given Henry's brother. He accepted the scholarship from Dr. Mendez and enrolled in night classes the following August. For the next 3 years, he split his weeks between a small apartment in Philadelphia and a classroom at the college outside Cleveland, finishing his bachelor's degree at 34, 15 years after he had first walked away from it. In the second year after his release, the model literacy program he designed at the nonprofit was adopted by correctional systems in 4 states. By the fourth year, it was operating in 11 states and 3 federal facilities, including the prison he had walked out of. The program is called, in every state where it runs, the Aldrich Method, although Marcus has asked, repeatedly and without success, that they change the name to something less personal. He went back to the federal facility for the first time 3 years after his release, on a Wednesday morning in October, as a credentialed instructor and consultant, with a state ID badge clipped to his lapel and a folder full of curriculum updates. The warden, who had retired the previous spring, drove down from Lancaster to meet him at the front gate. The two of them walked through the front door of the prison together and down the long corridor to the second floor of the education building. The classroom was full. 16 men in khaki uniforms were sitting at the long tables, bent over workbooks, while a tall young man in his 30s stood at the chalkboard explaining fractions. The young man was Eduardo, the first man who had ever passed the GED in Marcus's program, who had come back after his own release on a contract basis to teach. Marcus stood in the doorway and watched for almost a full minute. Then he went in. In the years since, the green spiral notebook has been replaced by a database. The database currently contains the names of more than 1,900 men and women who have earned high school equivalency credentials inside correctional facilities through programs based on the curriculum Marcus first wrote on legal pads in the dim light of a federal cell. He keeps a printed list of those names in his office drawer, the same way he once kept the green notebook in the locked drawer of a classroom desk, and he reads through it on the first Sunday of every month with a cup of coffee and a quiet hour to himself. He married, eventually, a woman who taught 4th grade in a public elementary school in North Philadelphia and who had volunteered in her 20s in a prison literacy program in another state. They have 2 children. He completed his master's degree at 37 and was offered, and accepted, an adjunct teaching position at the college outside Cleveland, where Dr. Mendez, now in his 80s, still serves on the board. He teaches 1 class, a semester, on adult education and learning theory. The class is full every term. Most of the students are education majors. A few, every year, are formerly incarcerated adults completing their own degrees through the program he helped design. His mother lived to see all of it. She passed 3 winters ago in her own bed, holding his hand, with her younger daughter on the other side, and a copy of the novel she had pressed into Marcus's hand at the county jail open on the bedside table. He read to her from it the night before she died. He read the same chapter he had read 4 times in a single week in a federal cell, on the night this story began, and his mother, who was tired and very far away, smiled at the sound of his voice and said, "You found it, didn't you?" He said yes. He said he had. Ray, who could not read his own name on the day Marcus first sat across from him at a metal table bolted to a cell wall, was released 6 years after Marcus. He went home to Pittsburgh and worked for 2 years as a janitor at a hospital, the same trade Marcus's father had practiced for 30 years, and he died of a second heart attack on a Sunday morning in his sister's kitchen, with the newspaper open in front of him to a column he was reading without difficulty. His sister called Marcus that afternoon. The 2 of them had never met in person. They spoke for almost an hour. At the end of the call, she said, "He wanted you to know he read every word of it." Marcus thanked her and got off the phone, and sat in his office with the door closed for a long time. The cell in B Unit where Marcus spent 9 years has been renumbered twice and houses, currently, 2 men who have never heard his name. The day room table under the broken light is still there. The light has been replaced. The classroom on the second floor of the education building has a small brass plaque next to the door that nobody asked Marcus's permission to install, and the plaque does not bear his name either, at his request. It bears instead a single sentence in plain block letters that he gave them when they asked what they should put on it. The sentence reads, "Every man in this room is more than the worst day of his life." 47 men learned to believe that sentence inside these walls. 1,900 more have learned it since. And somewhere in a federal prison tonight, a man is sitting across a metal table from another man, tracing the shape of a lowercase b in a notebook with a stubby golf pencil, and asking, with no embarrassment at all, "Am I doing it right?" The answer is yes.